many weeks. And Jake is unique to the crew that we have this season, because Jake is actually a rabbinical student, but even more importantly is a pressman parent. And so even though we are bringing in people from all over LA, and it was important to me that Jake be part of that, you're really you're coming from within as opposed to from without, which is really awesome. So Jake is,
but also from without,
right? He's a rabbinical student at HUC, and was the intern at Emanuel and is still doing some teaching for them there. And as you know, Emanuel is one of the shuls that we work very closely with throughout the year for programming, et cetera. So it's my real honor to have Jake teaching us this morning. I gave a little bit of an intro as to what you did in a previous life, but you can share more.
Awesome.
Yeah, from the Bima.
Thank you, Rabbi Schatz. Thanks, everybody. Good Shabbos. So I guess, as you may or may not have heard, I am a rabbinical student at HUC. I've got 4 years under my belt, so closing in on the finish, we hope. But before this, I was a speechwriter and worked in public affairs and policy, sort of doing a mix of politics and also executive communications and strategy of various kinds. So this today, hopefully, we're gonna bridge a little bit. So we're talking about Devarim as a whole here, which we just heard beautifully. And what is it? What is Devarim? Last book of the Torah, yeah. What else? Words, that's right. Things, events, right? A recap, excellent.
It's like Moshe's retelling of everything that's happened.
Retelling, that's right. And, well, if you saw the title that I gave for this, it's one other thing which we haven't said yet. Moshe's last speech. It's his valedictory address. It's his, I'm sorry?
He went to the show this morning.
Oh, yeah, exactly. It's his valediction. Yeah. It's his valediction. So as the story goes, the camp arrives on the eastern end of the Jordan, and they hang out for a long time while Moses gets in his last words, basically. And so as we heard on page 981, we heard it opens, and I'll just go through this really quickly.
Well, definitely, actually, it has a lot of basic tenets of Judaism, and it really tells you how to read, and it tells you how to handle money, it tells you a lot of stuff.
That's right. So it handles a lot of stuff jammed in there. And the thing that's holding it, though, is, as it opens here, I'm just going to read in English, Ele Dvarim Asher Diber Moshe. These are the words Moshe spoke to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan, through the wilderness, etc. Here's how they got there. It was in the 40th year. On the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this teaching, he said. And then we get the retelling, some of the fundamental tenets. It seems academics or scholars suggest that there are 4 or maybe 5 speeches here that are sort of merged together. And you can tell because most of Devarim, the book, not the Parsha, is in the first person from Moshe. And you have a couple of these sort of sections, like these first 5 sentences, that are this unnamed third person narrator that corresponds to the narration that we get through most of the rest of the Torah. So with that, I'm going to pass out some sheets. All right, so with that, we're going to talk about Devarim as rhetoric, and specifically as farewell rhetoric. And I want to give the caveat, of course, that biblical literature is unique and it's really impossible to compare to any other genre, and especially anything that came millennia afterwards. So there's a little bit of imagination that we're going to use here, but also this valediction, the goodbye address, is this trans-historical or actual uber-historical genre that does date back to the ancient Near East. So it is, and has evolved explicitly in relation to the original ideas of it since then. So again, we're imagining a little bit, but hopefully that's going to help us illuminate the text a bit. And I also just want to acknowledge that I'm doing something potentially pedagogically dubious here, which is to say I have some things that I've, in my reading I've unearthed and that we can talk about, but I really would love to sort of explore a lot of this together and see what we surface together. And I'm not really charging us in one direction. Well, he hasn't given one yet. He hasn't given one yet. But I thought about it. I thought about including what he said so far, but I've got precedents in here. And the other caveat I want to say is we're talking about Devarim as a whole book, and we're not actually going to look at Devarim as a whole book because we don't have that kind of time. And so, first of all, I'm just asking you to sort of just trust me with it, that it really says what I'm telling you it says. And also, we're going to start with a summary that hopefully should help us. So, do we have a volunteer to read our first text, which is this summary from Everett Fox in his introduction to Devarim in the Shocking Bible?
Just make sure that you use a microphone.
Great. Where was our? Oh.
Moshe's addresses, which include a historical review, repeated appeals to observe God's laws, and dire warnings against their violation, a reworking of previous laws and the addition of new ones, and a poem designed to keep the appeals and warnings in popular memory, have about them a deep rhetorical urgency. As an extended piece of argumentation and pleading, Deuteronomy holds pride of place in the Torah with its specialized vocabulary, its alternately pleading and warning tone, and its long, elegant phrases.
Yeah? Say more. Why does it sound, I think.
No, the actual sound.
Oh.
Oh, it's just loud.
Does this sound like the biblical work that we know? Does this sound like the Torah that we know? This characterization? Does anything jump out at us here as being different from what we're used to when we talk about Torah text?
The addition of new laws.
New laws, right? Strange.
It also explicitly calls Devarim poetry. It also explicitly calls Devarim poetry, which is a different form of text to think about. It has a whole new set of rules.
Yeah. Excellent. Well said.
Yeah, like how Zeno is written, right? The way it's written in the Torah looks it's the way you see in Parshat HaZinu, the way the text is laid out. Mm-hmm. It's like poetry instead of like the way it is in the rest of the Torah, aside from Shirat Hayam.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some layout stuff here and elsewhere. Yeah. And what about this idea of argumentation? Do we think that the Torah, the rest of the time, does that feel like argumentation? Does that feel like a genre we would use to describe Torah?
No.
No.
No, it doesn't. I mean,
Yeah.
the rest of the Torah, like if we think about this week's Parsha, there's just a lot of stuff that we're told, but there's no argumentation of, or even feeling of whether or not the way that we are hearing it or learning it from the Torah is the way that the person or people affected actually dealt with it. Whereas Deuteronomy, because it's very often in the first person, we're hearing a recapitulation of our history, but through a person's actual feelings and perspective in terms of how he actually experienced it.
There's an emotion in the narration with which that's wholly new. Even to the degree there's poetry already, there's like an emotion to this because it's like a first person. It's something else. So we're going to look at, actually first I want to pass these out. These are supplementary. I realized later might be helpful. This is from the same author, Everett Fox. This is his outline of the whole book of Deuteronomy, Devarim. So just for reference as we continue to talk. So while those are going around, I want to look at, I've got excerpts from what I'm going to consider, and I'm just going to say it, the 3 most famous farewell addresses in American history. This is my assertion. And do we have, let's see. I'm going to read the Washington just because it's kind of dense, and I've got some experience with it. Great. All right. So Washington, he opens by saying some nice things, and then he says, and then he stops himself. He says, "Here perhaps I ought to stop, but a solicitude for your welfare, which cannot end but with my life, and the apprehension of danger natural to that solicitude, urge me, on an occasion like the present, to offer to your solemn contemplation, and to recommend to your frequent review some sentiments which are the result of much reflection, of no inconsiderable observation, and which appear to me all important to the permanency of your felicity as a people." So I've tried really hard, and now I can't help myself but keep telling you what you got to do. And he focuses this address, which, by the way, was really actually written, not ever delivered. So actually, it has that in common with Devarim. And he focuses on three arguments. We're going to look at two of them that he wants to leave with the people of Israel. Towards the preservation of your government and the permanency of your present happy state, it is requisite not only that you steadily discountenance irregular oppositions to its acknowledged authority, but also that you resist with care the spirit of innovation upon its principles, however specious the pretexts. One method of assault may be to effect, in the forms of the Constitution, alterations which will impair the energy of the system and thus to undermine what cannot be directly overthrown. So that's to say, we've given you, I'm leaving the office, but we've given you the Constitution. Use that. And also, not only use that, but be careful with how you amend it. We've given you the power to interpret it, to amend it, to alter it, but be conservative in your approach to it. And remember, especially, that for the efficient management of your common interests in a country so extensive as ours, a government of as much vigor as is consistent with the perfect security of liberty is indispensable. So here's how you guard the government, and the government is all built to serve one particular purpose. We have this value, liberty. That's number one. Guard it, protect it, and we've given you the how to do it. He goes on to say, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. Where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? So if we're not religious, then how can we ever know that anyone's telling the truth? Because in a court of justice or anywhere else, you're sworn in invoking God's name. And with caution, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. So the two arguments we've got here are, I've given you the Constitution, stick to it. This is a set of laws that will help you survive, achieve permanency, and also elevate the signature principle on which this is all based. Second of all, religion. It's the ethical, moral basis for everything else that follows. Does anybody know, was George Washington particularly religious? Doubtful? Yeah, that's basically the scholarly consensus, is like that. I'm sorry?
Right,
Well-
that's why he was asking if people think that they might know, right? It's
Yeah.
not a fact, but-
Yeah, we don't really know, but he used a lot of religious language. And the idea is that he wasn't particularly religious, the sort of scholarly consensus, but he was a man of his time. And among other things, the Bible was the literature that was accessible to the most people. So if you wanted to pull out any kind of literary reference that other people would understand, you really only had one or many books to choose from. So he was relying on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of our, at that time, a lot of the early colleges in America were affiliated with religion somehow.
Yeah.
And they, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of it was just in the water supply. Whether or not he was personally religious, it was just the environment.
It's also interesting because, I mean, like, one of the sort of natural conclusions of freedom of religion is freedom from religion, and this almost, I feel like it could represent sort of his way of inserting his own commentary to say that, like, yes, we could derive that from this text that we've established, however, we should be careful not to take it to such an extent, and actually, so he's tying, like, is tying ethical living to religiosity and saying that, yeah, you could get that from this text, but let's not go that far.
I think that's really insightful, and I would love to go down that, but also we could just talk about Washington. But to that end, I do want to recommend that Washington's Thanksgiving Day proclamation for the first Thanksgiving in the United States from 1789 concludes with a lot of these ideas, and into them he interweaves another set of ideals, which is science and reason. And to him, all of these go together. They're not indistinguishable, but intractable. And I strongly recommend reading for his thoughts on the American project that I think correspond very strongly to lots of tenets of liberal Judaism. All right, this on the page 2, on the top of page 2, we have perhaps what I think of as like the most famous goodbye of all time. Is anybody familiar with Lou Gehrig's most famous quote?
No, I'm familiar with the Lou Gehrig.
That's right.
What is most famous?
We're about to hear it. So Lou Gehrig, Titan, Iron Man, famous Yankee. All of a sudden in 1939, he can't play at all, and so he basically quits pretty quickly. And on July 4th, he's no longer on the club, but they have Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day on July 4th, and in between the doubleheader, they have this whole ceremony, and he gives this speech. He says, "For the past 2 weeks, you've been reading about the bad break I got. Yet today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of this earth. I have been in ballparks for 17 years and have never received anything but kindness and encouragement from you fans." Then he goes on to talk about all of the famous people, baseball and society leaders who are there around him. And then he talks about his own personal life. The New York Giants, the team they were playing against, had given him a gift, and he's got all the groundskeepers at the ballpark love him, and his mother-in-law even takes his side even when he's fighting with his wife. And his parents worked for him to have the education and build his body, and his wife is wonderful. He says, so I close in saying that I may have had a tough break, but I have an awful lot to live for.
That's actually, in some ways, and it's possible this is where you're going with all of these, but in some ways, that is so much more connected to Moshe than the George Washington speech, because Moshe knows that he's not going to go into the land, and yet he realizes, and not in Lou Gehrig's words, but he realizes that he was so lucky to have been able to take the people to the precipice of this land, and how wonderful it is to see them go in even if he doesn't get to. And so this actually, had you not put these two things together, I think I still would have come to the conclusion that these two things are very similar.
Yeah.
And that Lou Gehrig is, for very different reasons, obviously, not going into his own promised land, but recognizes all the joy that brought him to the place that he's at.
I think that's right, and also at the same time, I think it disentangles him from his own accomplishments.
Yeah.
Sort of not. I mean, Moshe is obviously much more complicated to do that. But if we were to imagine Moshe having this experience, perhaps there's a moment of I've done everything. I mean, we talked about him pleading and the argumentation of Dvarim, but it's maybe also like in a healthy for his own. If we're imagining Moshe as a character, maybe healthy for his own boundaries. Sure. I will say that at this point, to some degree, we might argue that Lou Gehrig crossed over into the promised land of baseball, because what they did, does anybody know what they did at Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day? They established a precedent that professional sports teams, all professional sports teams, continue to follow.
They retired his number.
Bingo, that's right. That was the first number ever retired. And it was like a novel idea. It was like, this guy means so much to us, and his fall was so precipitous. The only thing we can possibly think to do is it's like he's still playing here with us, but he can't. So they retired his number.
There's also, we're looking at the George Washington versus Lou Gehrig as far as like tenor, which I understand maybe like a strange comment to make, but like there's something to be said about the fact that like the tenor of Lou Gehrig's words are very everyday, very, very, they have a really broad appeal.
Yeah.
And like sort of tie into like Moshe Rabbeinu's sort of leadership. I guess to me, look, I always call this idea of like Lo B'Shmayim, right? Like to sort of like bring it down to earth. And these feel like very down to earth words of like, yeah, maybe you you see me in a certain way, maybe you idolize me, whatever, but I'm gonna like pull the curtain back and say like, look, I've got a tough hand dealt to me, and yet, you know, like I've got plenty to live for, and maybe you do too. Maybe you can see yourself in me. Maybe my experience could be something to you.
Yeah. I mean, it was considered inspirational at the time. I mean, people really were blown away by it, including because he cried, which like.
Well, it's emotional to even
Right.
be in this room.
Yeah.
And it's like such a beautiful.
But the whole conversation, I mean, tells you how distant and also not our conversation around masculinity is. But the world was floored by his emotion. I mean, he was known for being the Iron Man for his consecutive starts, and in fact for his consecutive innings played.
But he plays, okay, Lou Gehrig loved baseball, and then he couldn't do baseball anymore, but that's a dilemma many people have to face. You know, what if
He was
you love
dying.
dancing and suddenly you can't dance? What
Yeah.
if you love to run and suddenly you can't run?
Yeah.
A dilemma like that, something like that happens to a large percentage of the population when what they love to do, and they can no longer do it, and they have to face the fact that they just can't do it anymore. So, and that happens quite a bit.
I think that gives it its power.
What?
I think that gives the power to Nico's point. Like, there's an everyman the dream should be that we should relate to those things that we're losing and still think of ourselves as the luckiest person on the face of the earth.
Well, it's very much like, I mean, like Celine Dion right now, right? Like the struggles that she went through, and like seeing her sing at, oh my God, like seeing her sing at the Olympics was like so emotional and such
Yeah.
a triumph that like everyone loves a comeback story. It's very much, I mean, like that wasn't, you know, the end of his story, but like this is the seed, this is the sort of like fuel for maybe that story, you know?
I think that's right. I think that's, really great comparison. He died less than 2 years later. Can we do the last one?
Yeah.
Great. So should we do?
Oh, yeah, you're fine.
Okay, great. So this last one, I put what it was, but it's known as something. Does anybody know what the remarks to striking Memphis sanitation workers in 1968? Does anyone know what that is?
Yeah, I know what it is. It was a strike of sanitation workers.
The remarks. Does anyone know what the remarks are?
What is it called? What is the remarks called?
That's where
Well, I am a
King
man.
was
Yeah.
killed, but he was there to address the sanitation workers. Martin Luther King, if he had lived, he probably would have gone into labor. He had very interested in labor.
I mean, this was in fact, the remarks here are on I pulled the full set of remarks from the AFSCME website, like from an AFL website, because he was speaking to the union. So this is known as the mountaintop speech.
Yes,
And it's an explicit reference to Moshe. Because he, among other things, as he arrived in Memphis, he was receiving death threats, explicit death threats. And he tells a story in the speech that's not here that they had the airline unpacked the plane when they found out he was on board to check every item of luggage, because there was concern there was going to be a bomb on board. And the other thing is he was sick and he wasn't supposed to speak. And his dear friend and colleague Ralph Abernathy spoke instead, and then everyone was sort of clamoring for King to get up and speak. And so he got up and sort of more or less extemporized these remarks. By the way, Lou Gehrig also spoke without notes. And there's a lot of, not controversy, but like question among people who pay attention to speechwriting history about like, did he write it or not? Apparently he spent the day before working out remarks with his wife. But he didn't when he went to the podium, but he decided he wasn't planning to speak. And then everybody was chanting, "Give us Lou, give us Lou," after Babe Ruth's remarks. And so he went up and spoke without notes. He and Babe Ruth, by the way, hated each other. And so it was, they hated each other. Yeah. Because Lou Gehrig's mother said nasty things about Babe Ruth's wife, I think. And Ruth apparently said to him, never say another word to me off the baseball field. But their coming together at the goodbye was, well, there you go, on the baseball field, yeah. And Ruth had been older, but he outlived Gehrig by like a decade. So King, this is April 3rd, I guess, 1968. Something is happening in Memphis, something is happening in our world. As you know, if I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of general and panoramic view of the whole human history up to now, And the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? He says, I'm now just going to fill in what I've ellipses here, which is he runs through, he says, I'd like to be in Egypt and cross the Red Sea. I'd like to be in ancient Rome. He sort of flies through history, hitting a bunch of significant spots. And he comes to say, strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. We've been forced to a point where we're going to have to grapple with the problems that men have been trying to grapple with through history, but the demand didn't force them to do it. Survival demands that we grapple with them. Men for years now have been talking about war and peace, but now no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence in this world. It's nonviolence or non-existence. That is where we are today. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Okay, so that's the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yeah. So just to be clear, just to fill in, the next day he was dead. Right? So I mean, the next day he was shot.
Yes, he was shot the next day.
So what jumps out at us? What jumps out? What do we got? How do we react? How do we respond to this? And what do we think in particular about his references to Moshe? Very direct comparison, yeah.
It's not only a comparison, he inhabits Moshe.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well said.
Well, it's almost like he, in a way, does Moshe one better in saying that, like, or, you know, I don't want to struck by lightning here right now, but like, say, like, I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. You know, like Moshe, when Moshe learned that he wasn't going to go into the promised land, like, argued with God, and that's when God let him go to the mountaintop, right?
Yeah.
But MLK here is saying, I've been to the mountaintop, actually know that I'm not going to be able to like, you know, reap the fruits of my labor, but I don't mind. Like, maybe that's not my role, and like, what's important here is that we continue to do the work that's necessary to get to where we need to be.
I wonder.
Hold on, Rosa, let him.
I was going to say, I wonder also if he had his own a sense of his own. I mean, from what we know about him, huge ego, many shortcomings. I wonder if he had a sense of his own shortcomings, right? That he wasn't comparing him. He didn't carry the upset of Moshe because he knew that he wasn't Moshe. You know, no prophet in Israel. He ain't it. I don't know.
These words like longevity had, at least I'm not concerned about that now. I found like he was predicting his own death.
Yeah, he was
Terrifying.
But he somehow knew that longevity was not his to be. He never hit age 40.
Yeah.
He probably knew it just wasn't in the cards for him.
I'm gonna say this argument would not have aged as well if he was not shot the next day, because comparing yourself to Moshe and saying, I am Moshe, I've done it in the mountain. It works if he died the next day, having become a sort of a hero of the civil rights movement. You know, if he lived another 30 or 40 years, this comparison might, to your point, been more ego than anything else.
Yeah.
It's so funny because I totally agree with that statement, but before I was thinking that this actually makes him sound quite humble, I think. I mean, I like to think of Moshe as a great leader because he was imperfect and because he was so incapable of seeing himself as a leader. He was actually great at being a leader because he just thought of himself as every other person. And King was not that way because of what people thought of King. Not maybe that's also what King thought of himself, but definitely what other people thought of him. And even the story that you set this up by sharing, that he was feeling ill and that people chanted for him to speak. Right? Maybe the way that I first read this, and maybe had you not set it up that way, I would have read it differently. But the fact that he's comparing himself to for all intents and purposes, an inadequate leader who did really amazing things and proved his strength, right, through all of these shortcomings, for lack of a better term. Maybe that actually shows some of King's humility, that he's able to recognize that he is not everything that everybody thought for him to be. And yet I agree that had he not died the next day, maybe this wouldn't have aged as well. But he's recognizing, like, I've taken us this far, no matter what happens the next day. I've taken us to this moment, but now it's your job to continue it, because I didn't have to be the one to take us there. I just was lucky enough, in Lou Gehrig's words, to be the guy to get us to the moment.
So two things that brings up for me. One is, so just as I'm hearing it, it sounds like you're saying, he's sort of saying, even Moses didn't get to the promised land. Like, even Moses got stopped on the mountaintop. Who am I to say that I get to go all the way?
Right.
Is that sort of?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think he's also just saying, like, don't worry about how far I get to go. Worry about how far you're all gonna go.
And the other thing that I wanted then, if he didn't die the next day, we would not think of it as prophetic in the same way. But this language, and also throughout the speech, and also throughout everything that he spoke, I mean, he was a reverend, right? And so I think, so he was particularly religious in contrast to Washington. But I think also it's worth considering that the vernacular, his audiences were twofold. His audiences were manifold, but in particular, he spoke so much in the language of religion and Bible to reach two particular audiences, one of which is white America, and he's emphasizing this is something we have in common, but also to Black Americans who also had a limited literary reference point because of the constraints of the world of Jim Crow, but had Bible. So perhaps not unlike Washington, he is relying on one of the core literary pieces of shared literature that his audience had.
They read the Bible. Now, the Black church was a very cohesive institution.
Yeah. Is it the same group coming back the other way? The other thing that I wanted to mention, about Moshe is sort of the magic of all of Dvarim is that Moses, lo ish Dvarim anochi, like he was not a man of words. And then what do we do at the last pivotal moment when we need him most? We're about to set off without him. What does he have for us? He has Dvarim, he has words. That's what he has to offer us. So as I was preparing this, I was thinking about what does Dvarim tell us about goodbye addresses? And I woke up this morning and realized that actually the interesting question, or what I sort of unearthed, was what do looking at other goodbye addresses tell us about Moshe? So if we take Dvarim, if we take it out of its other kinds of context and where it emerged and it was this hidden book and all of that, what can we think about Moses in this moment of saying goodbye? What seems to rise to the top, and what can we latch onto?
I think that it's interesting because there's a cynical take that you can take with Devarim and saying it's Moshe's take on everything that's happened, that he's sort of applying a revisionist history to what's gone on. But also you have to think of this parsha that we read of you moving camp to here, to moving camp there, moving camp to there, to keep things moving. And in a way, it's like maybe there's a value to, maybe there's a more pragmatic way of looking at these words that Moshe has delivered and saying we could get lost in the analysis of it, but what we need to do is we need to keep things moving. Otherwise we're gonna get stuck, and then what's the point of this journey at all? Thank you.
Yeah.
The big theme for me is the immense amount of gratitude for what Moshe did. When you think about liberating the people, a lot of what was in the Bible at that time is still true today. The idea that people, having been slaves think from Lou Gehrig to Washington, Martin Luther King, and Moshe, of course, what I get out of is a tremendous amount of gratitude. for what they taught us.
Yeah.
The importance of being able to prepare others to take over, the importance of knowing that you're eventually gonna have to turn the reins over to somebody else.
Yeah.
That time will come.
Yeah. Yeah, he spends a few sections on Joshua and on, many sections on what happens after you leave and you'll go into land and hear the laws, but also I've set you up with someone to come after me. I think perhaps all of these are really interesting and meaningful answers. The question I asked was, what is reading Moshe, rather than reading these addresses through the lens of Dvarim, what do we get from reading Dvarim through the lens of as a valedictory address? And one thing that stuck out to me also is that he's giving us this, he's talking in content about the way forward, but he's also doing it, which is to say, he's looking back at the idea, at everything that's come before, and in his refashioning and in his retelling, he's also done the first thing that Everett Fox, actually, whose summary I used before, he says it's like the what's the quote? It's one of the most important functions of Jewish life is the explaining of Torah. And so he gets up there and he says, he refashions the Torah, he retells it, he puts himself in it, and he says to us, this is all of our story, it's a canon, but it's all of ours, and we will continue to retell it, and that's the thing that will carry forward.